I'm Luke Hagerty for the Lake Erie Regional Grape Program, and with me today is Kevin Martin, and we're going to do a podcast today talking to Kevin about some of the economics behind the cover crop data that we've gathered over the past 2 years. So with the as part of the project that looking at cover crops, we looked at yield and we looked at vine size and that correlation with cover crops, and we started to find some pretty interesting things. So Kevin's been taking a look at that. Kevin, do you want to kind of maybe start a little bit about what we're finding?
Absolutely. So when we first started looking at this project, the one thing we were really focused on were seed costs and application costs, and trying to justify why a grower would do cover crop, as many growers in our area don't utilize cover crops for their row middle management. And I think we can talk a little bit more about that. It is kind of a complicated question because there are so many seed mixes, but really I think the focus is just on having cover crops versus not having cover crops, because what we found is some pretty dramatic effects, and those effects happened with some relatively inexpensive seed mixes, sort of shifting our focus away from what seed costs and towards how we manage cover crops. So for example, we saw a relatively dramatic increase in some of the heavy clay sites when we use cover crops versus not using cover crops. And what that really translates to from an economic perspective is at least a $225 increase in gross revenue per acre. That investment was around $40 to $50 per acre to get that $225 increase. We want to look at this for a few more years if we can to see if that $225 increase is a one-time increase or if it's more of a permanent benefit as a result of increasing the soil health. We know at least, though, that we saw that increase in between the third and fourth year of cover crops on that heavy clay soil. So that was really impressive and probably more dramatic than what I expected.
So we're seeing, and just to kind of get into a little more of the background on there, with the heavy clay, we saw where there wasn't cover crop, we had half-pound vines, and where there was cover crop, we were, almost 1.25 pounds vine for that vine size average, and that's a big difference right there. And then when we actually did the yield on that, and we found that the cover crop was almost a ton higher than the on-cover crop stuff. However, when we moved to the gravelly sites, I think we saw there was a little more risk there, where we had cover crop, especially big vines and cover crops, and that where we had cover crops on big vines on gravel sites, we saw a decrease in vine size. So I mean, there is risks there, and maybe you can talk about some of the risks with cover crops and how we can navigate around them.
In some way, I think we can almost talk about one of our failures in terms of cover crop management. And, I think that's the point of research is we try to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And a late termination or no termination on gravel in a dry year has some really dramatic effects. And to some of our growers, that may be stating the obvious, but those effects were actually very dramatic. So we're looking at a 2.5 pound vine nearly on a gravel site in terms of what our average was, and we were reducing that to a 1 pound vine. So we're going from a relatively healthy, decent performing vineyard to something that's really struggling and needs rehab in the course of a single year. So we're looking at a decrease in yield of about $200 per acre related to that water stress, and most of that presented itself in berry size. And in addition to that, since it did present itself in berry size, that stress was already there. So you're looking at probably at least another $350 in potential crop loss.
Right, because we're looking at that vine size decreased, and now going into 2017, we have smaller vines, and we're not sure what to expect off of them, or we're expecting less off of them because we did push them with that competition with the cover crop.
Right.
Because I think our termination time was into June, and most of the cover crop had already died at that time just because of drought stress. So we really pushed it kind of to the max, and kind of like you mentioned, that failure really showed. But some of the other participating growers in this project, they had that late May. Somewhere in late May is when they terminated. And on some of the better sites, or where their big vines are at, even at that point, there was still competition and was driving down yield and vine size on the bigger vines on those sites. So I think looking at an earlier termination is really a key or really important thing to kind of look at going into the future.
Yeah, and I really think that there's a potential for gravel sites to benefit as much as heavy clay or more, sort of because of we think of a gravel site as better for vineyards, and for the most part it often is. But the sort of the benefits that cover crops offer may disproportionately benefit those gravel sites, but only if you manage it correctly. And
Right.
it looks to be a lot more finicky. So just be careful with your termination dates.
Yes.
I think if you do that, you eliminate the risk of those huge economic losses. And again, I think that's why we're not focused on seed costs at this point anymore. We're going to have that information available to you. Luke's got some great recommendations about different seed blends for different long-term goals. But for the most part, we want to make sure growers are careful about how they manage termination and how they bump up their vine size instead of decreasing it, because that's really where the rubber meets the road when it comes to economics.
Absolutely, and I think that, at least with the pruning weights and some of the other, data that we've looked at so far, that, any vineyard on heavy sites that have smaller vines, we can see some huge benefits by using cover crops.
And I think with that, like I said, we're going to have some more information, but this is a good place to stop for now. Let you digest some of those numbers. Thanks for being here with us. If you have any other questions about cover crops or other topics, please let us know in the comments below. Or if you're one of our growers, I'm sure you know other ways to get a hold of us, but we'd really appreciate some ideas for videos as well. So we want to answer your questions. So if you've got them, let us know.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.